Hi everyone, it's Gracie here. I'm really excited to share a devotional with you guys today. Somebody who who's been on the mind a little bit recently is somebody from the Bible. Is our well-known favorite King David. The other day I heard the phrase used at school or something, I can't remember, a man after God's own heart. And immediately, like a lot of you, I thought of David because that's where that phrase comes from. That's who we know as a man after God's own heart. Yet, also, I started to think about David's wrongdoings, some of the things that David did that we would not consider to be great things, like lusting after another man's wife and having that man killed so that he could have her as his wife, and have her child, among other things. And I thought, wait a second, why do we call David a man after God's own heart? David made a lot of mistakes. David was not always the greatest guy. David kind of had some prideful moments. David kind of mocked Saul sometimes before David formally became king. There were some not so great moments for David. So I was like, wait a second, why do we call him a man after God's own heart again? And so I looked at the scriptures, always a good thing to do, and looked for that phrase. And when it's used by Samuel talking to Saul. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. Samuel is the prophet, and he's delivering Saul some not so great news. He says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So, sad news for Saul, but, this is what Lord commanded. So we find out some information about what a man after God's own heart is supposed to do, or what that heart looks like. Because at this point, we don't know that David is going to be, that who this person is that's going to be king after Saul. But we do know that Saul is not a man after God's own heart. Why? Because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now, what the Lord commanded Saul to do is to lead Israel and to keep them as God's nation, God's chosen people. So that is to keep them following God's commandments. That is to keep them following God's laws, to keep them in the right mindset, following after God. The number one commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, mind, and strength. And Saul has not kept that command. Yet we discover that David is going to be the person that God sees as somebody after God's own heart. Because we see that God looks at the heart. That might sound familiar as well. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, when Samuel goes to anoint David. And most of David's family is pretty surprised as to why they're picking David, the youngest, this 13-year-old, why why God would pick David to be the next king. But Samuel lets the family know that the Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So once again, looking at the heart of David. The heart of David is after God. The heart of David loves God and wants to keep God's commands. Does David mess up? You bet. But David repents. David seeks forgiveness. And those mistakes don't define David. God does not let those mistakes define David. So are there mistakes that you've made that you think disqualify you from being used by God? Are there mistakes that you've made that you think disqualify you from being used by God? Making mistakes and being a person after God's own heart are not mutually exclusive. You can make mistakes and you can still be used by God. I want to encourage you with that truth today, and I pray that you all have a wonderful rest of your week, rest of your weekend, and we will see you soon.